Greetings, EPQers, and welcome to Conclusions. Well done, you are almost there. There's a little bit more to do after this. You've got your presentation and you've got your evaluation, and then possibly a host of reworking, tweaking, and all sorts of other admin before you hand in, but you are within sniffing distance of the finish line. So keep moving forward. So, the conclusion, it's part of, for the mark scheme lovers amongst you, it is part of AO3, so it's still part of the main discussion. It's not a separate thing, although it can be considered separately. I don't think there's necessarily a very specific recommended word limit for it, but I think around 500 words is what it would take to cover all of the things that need to be covered. Now, the mark scheme highlights a couple of really important things. So first of all, it's a clear and well-developed conclusion that proficiently summarises the point of view in the case that's been made. We'll come on and see what that means in a bit of depth later on. So it's clear and it summarises the points of view. Other things that will be a little bit less familiar, especially for those historians amongst you who are quite, and other humanities students who are quite used to writing, conclusions. This second part is a little bit strange and new, perhaps. So there are well thought out suggestions for further work and an awareness of wider implications. So what else could you do, and what is the significance to the world beyond your EPQ? So some interesting ideas that we'll talk through in a bit. So what should a conclusion structure look like? You can do it in a variety of different ways. There's no clear formal way to structure your conclusion, but I think this makes logical and coherent sense because I think these things flow into each other. So you start off by summarizing your arguments and answering the question with great clarity, and we'll have a look at that in a little bit more depth. Now, because you've given a clear answer to the question that you've asked, you can now go and discuss in another paragraph or section the wider implications of your conclusion. Now, integrated into that paragraph, or perhaps again as a consequence of some of the wider implications of your conclusion, you can look at further work that needs to be done. So summarize and answer, wider implications, further work. I think that's a good, clean, simple structure. There could well be ways of integrating all of these together, and again, don't feel rigidly bound by this as a format, because I could see some EPQs where all of them are kind of woven together in a perfectly valid and clear and wonderful way. But if you want that clarity of structure, go with this one. So let us move on. So thinking back to the rest of your discussion, you've got 3, 4, 5 main arguments. Now you need to clearly summarize those arguments and explain again in detail, but with great clarity, the sort of sub-conclusions that you reached. Now, another thing I think that would be really important to do in this section is to show how all of these arguments link together, because linking sections in EPQ is an extremely important part of the mark scheme. You really want to avoid a detached series of little mini essays. So how can we link them together? Well, a good way of linking them together is going to be debating their relative significance. So what you might find in the main body of your discussion with your 4 different sections, say, is that section 1 has argued yes to your question. Should drugs be legalized? So section 1, yes, because of health benefits. Section 2 might be no, because of economic cost. Now, health benefits versus economic costs, there's going to be a further debate to be had as to which of those is more significant, because on the face of it, you could say, well, we've got half saying yes, half saying no, therefore we can't come to a conclusion. But that's not normally how life and arguments work. Some arguments will be more powerful than others. So even though you may have section 1 and section 2 arguing yes, section 3 and section 4 arguing no, there will be a kind of overall judgment as to whether the sections arguing yes are actually more significant, more powerful than the sections arguing no, or vice versa. And that's a little bit of an argument you can have in your conclusion, or rather you can explain how this builds to your final conclusion. So even though section 1 argues yes, and even though section 2 argues no, the impact of section 1 on the global population is far more significant than the impact of section 2 on the global population. Therefore, my conclusion is so. And one of the ways of writing a sophisticated conclusion is as I did there, explaining the significance. So why is something even more significant? So once you've established the kind of relative significance, if you like, of all those sections, compared them with each other, move on then to answer the question with great clarity and explain using the language that you yourself have created for the question. So, should murder be legalized? Your sort of final answer would be yes, murder should be legalized because da, da, da. So you've just got to make sure you do actually answer your question. Sometimes you read conclusions and there's all sorts of interesting thoughts and ideas, but it's still not very clear what the student actually thinks about everything. Now, I hope this doesn't seem too contradictory, but whilst the clear answer is easiest for you, should we go to Jupiter? Yes, no. Should murder be legalized? Yes, no. Sometimes it's not possible to reach a conclusion with that degree of clarity, although you can give a clear answer. So, a classic example could be with a technological development EPQ. So, at this particular point in time, it is unclear whether we have sufficient technology to change our financial system over to one run by blockchain or whatever, or whatever. So there is a clarity to the answer, but it isn't necessarily a simple yes or no. Now, if you cannot give that simple yes or no, but still give a clear answer, then explain why. It could be a limitation of knowledge, it could be a limitation of technology, it could be all sorts of different things. It could be that in your research you just found that the question was so complex you couldn't just give this kind of simple answer. So if you're exploring a global phenomenon like should we legalize prostitution globally, you could perhaps say, following research, I realized that there's just so many different issues in so many different countries and cultures and things like that it's not possible to answer this question clearly on a global scale, and the answer has to be established on a national scale or something along those lines. So all of these things are crystal clear answers to the question, even though they don't come up with a simple one necessarily. So just remember that the answer has got to be crystal clear, but the answer can be nuanced. Hopefully that makes sense. And I think for the vast majority of EPQs, there'll be a simple, solid answer after a little bit of debate. Okay, now the next part of the conclusion will be the wider implications, and again this will vary so much. But the simple question here is, what are the consequences of your conclusion? So having established that prostitution should be legalized, for example, what then does that mean for society? In some places that could be a kind of a revolution of law, of how we live, of depictions in the media, of take your pick. Should we go to Mars? the consequences would be could be we need to go to Mars as soon as we possibly can. Therefore, there should be a huge diversion of funds to every nation's space program, or there should be a kind of a unified global space program. There's all sorts of really kind of fascinating and interesting kind of conclusions that can or implications from your answer. But one thing you really need to do is be a little bit sane about this, be a little bit measured in your responses, and because occasionally students get a little bit carried away and say, well, I've disproved the validity of capitalism as a system, therefore global communism needs to be introduced tomorrow. You're not a mad dictator. You don't have unlimited global power. You need to be very cautious and balanced and measured, and acknowledge that you're putting forward some potentially not necessarily unrealistic ideas, but things that are going to require an awful lot of thought. So couch it in sort of sensible language. So this EPQ has reached the conclusion that drugs should be legalized. This will have vast implications potentially for governmental tax systems, and in the future research will need to be done as to the best way of calculating drug profits or something along those lines. So just couch it in sensible, moderated language. So wider implications. Then we need to move on to further work. Now again, there's in some EPQs the sort of further work and wider implications can smush together quite easily and naturally and sensibly in the same paragraph, so you don't have to split them. But if you want to, think of it like this. So now that you've answered the question, now that you've thought about the implications, are there other areas that you would want to go back and look at in order to answer the question? And a great thing to do is to refer back here to the limitations in your introduction, because one of the things that you're always trying to do with your EPQ is show that it links together, and it's not just these little isolated chunks. So for example, in your EPQ, did you, if you were doing should we legalize drugs, did you only focus on sort of man-made pharmaceuticals rather than magic mushrooms or whatever, things like that? If you talked about should we legalize prostitution, did you exclude strippers or something like that? Were there sort of limitations that you put in your introduction that allowed you to do a manageable EPQ? And can you now go back and refer to those limitations and say, well, here's the conclusion that I reached within these limitations, but now having gone through this whole process, I think it's really important that I do explore some of the areas that I didn't previously because of time, because of technical ability, because of whatever. It's also a good way, like I said, of linking parts of the EPQ together. Other really interesting things to do are new areas raised by research. So as you go as you've gone through your EPQ, you may have come across a whole field of study or theory or issue that you were not aware existed, and maybe that would be something you really need to do a lot more information on to kind of contribute to the answer, to add to the EPQ. So and sometimes that can happen with sort of relatively new events, if you like. So imagine if you're doing your EPQ on terrorism, and then towards the end of your EPQ you have a significant act of terrorism by a group with an ideology that wasn't really a sort of major player or major factor when you were writing your EPQ. Maybe there's a new invention that you've only just discovered, or not you kind of inventing away, but you through your research you've picked out someone who's put forward an interesting idea that wasn't a major part of your EPQ because it was so theoretical. So if you're doing a sort of should we should we alter the human genome or something? And you use it, you're looking at all the cutting edge scientific research, all the arguments, all the issues, and then you see one guy has put forward some new technique for manipulating genes, or new consequences or something, and you just haven't really gone down that route, but your research has brought it up. So again, and it's just asking a question, and again, don't this is only really a couple of lines, and of course try and put in a little bit of detail. Name the technique, name the individual, name the new school of thought, name the new technological advancement, or be specific about the event that's changed, or encourage you to look in a different direction. Now, a sort of final area is possibly new questions arisen based on the conclusions, and that does feed, obviously that can feed into wider implications again, but if you just want this kind of crystal clear solid structure. So if prostitution is legalized, what new questions need to be asked? How should prostitution be taught in school? Actually, that sounds really dodgy, but you know what I mean. How should the depiction of prostitution be taught in school? Should drugs be, if drugs are now legalized, how should the public be informed of their use? Should you have training in how to safely take drugs? And again, with all the variety of different EPQs, that might be a really important kind of sort of fundamental societal change that brings about a lot of new questions. For others, not so much, perhaps. So in a sense, that's it. That's you've got your summaries of your arguments and your crystal clear answer. You've got your wider implications, and you've got your further work. 3 nice sections to the conclusion. So moving on, last slide, a couple of tips for your conclusion. So don't introduce new information to answer the question. Now, if obviously you've picked out a new technique or idea or something in your research in the latter part of the conclusion, then yeah, bring it up and say, well, this is what I discovered, and this would be a great area to explore in future. But when you're answering your question, don't bring in new information that you haven't already brought up in your discussion. The second thing you need to do, which is bizarre how often this happens, but your conclusion has actually got to match your discussion. So every now and again I read a conclusion and I go, well, that's not what you actually argued in section 2. Now, yes, there's a little bit of a difference when you're looking at your EPQ as a whole work, in comparison to sections, but fundamentally it does actually have to match the discussion that you've had. Other top tips: so acknowledge the limitations, and again, don't go overboard. But when you're looking at further work, wider implications, what else you need to do, what you couldn't have done, acknowledge it. That's okay. So especially connecting it to further implications. Should prostitution be legalized? Well, I only focused on women in prostitution rather than men, so that may have significantly skewed the results, and therefore for further research I need to explore it from a male perspective, or whatever you like. And as we've talked about before, just be careful about how you word some of the wider implications and further research. Some delicate, sensitive language. Remember, you're not a global dictator who can fundamentally organize a space program tomorrow, or end capitalism, or redefine gender, or all of these things that you can absolutely make arguments for, and they can be very valid, natural sort of ways to go forward, but just be a bit measured about how you express them. Lovely. Well, that's that from me. Hopefully that all makes sense. Obviously, if it doesn't, do send me a message over Teams, and I shall catch up with you all for your presentations. Take care, guys.